Everyone, this is Ross Raddi, and welcome to another episode of Fruit Talk. This is the podcast style video that I do for you guys every Wednesday night at 9 o'clock Eastern. We talk a lot about fruits and a lot about vegetables and how to use that stuff in the kitchen and also how to grow it. You know, the really weird and interesting fruits that maybe you've never heard of before. One fruit that we love to talk about is figs. And in tonight's episode, we're actually going to be talking about figs once again. I have a number of things that I've learned this year, and I wanted to go over that with you guys. If you go on our website here, figboss.com, you can check out the blog. Subscribe down at the bottom, by the way. You can just type in your email, and you'll get notified every time we make a new blog post. But this is a recent one that we did, and it really is all about everything I've learned this year, and it's been so much I feel like I've learned this year, and we're still really over 2 months away from our frost. So there's still plenty of time left of the season, but I've already kind of come to a lot of conclusions this year. Even the varieties that I'm going to keep and the varieties I'm going to get rid of and what my plans are for next year. It really is something that I didn't really have to think too much on. It just kind of all came together at once. It was all very obvious, it seemed like to me. Here's actually a photo. If you're looking at the blog right now, here's a photo of, I think, 14 different varieties that we got to try on Sunday. On Monday. So it's been a really interesting fig season so far. The quality hasn't been there exactly, but I've been really enjoying it for sure. I've had a number of fruits today and yesterday that were actually much better quality. So the quality's getting there. We're almost there to, different fruits that are really going to impress me. But it just is what it is when you have the first few fruits of the season. Additionally, an inconsistency in the moisture content of the soil, which has led to a little bit of dropping. Some haven't really ripened fully. Others have split, believe it or not. So really getting that consistent moisture is really important. So let me read you guys this blog post and kind of expand upon it just a bit. So what my plan is I'm actually going to downsize quite a bit this fall. In fact, I think I'm going to get rid of a number of trees this summer. If people are interested, rather than having them pick them up in the fall, I think pretty soon I'm going to have a list available that people can come by and pick up these trees. So essentially what I'm trying to do, though, is downsize the pots, the amount of the pots, and move over to in-ground trees. I looked at my spreadsheet. I took inventory a few days, like last week or something, and I hit 300 varieties, not just different varieties, but 300 varieties that I'm maintaining currently. So that includes like duplicates and different limbs. There's over 300 different things that I have to maintain, and that's just with the figs. So it's quite a bit, and I don't really need all that. It's been nice to experiment with many varieties and taste all these different flavors and different figs, but it's just very obvious to me what it is that I like, and those figs that are like that, it's very apparent to me, and it's also becoming very apparent which varieties just perform better here and just to me have an overall better rating. It's worth it, I think, having the really tasty varieties as well, but I'm only going to keep about 10% of those, which are the really late varieties. So 10% of my potted fig collection or potted fig production is going to be of late varieties. Most of them are got to be really tasty, so like Cordon Blanc and Black Madeira and those different types of figs within that. That's pretty much it. In fact, I'm mostly going to be getting rid of all of my Black Madeiras. We'll see how they do this year in terms of their splitting. I'm going to give them one more year. None of them have ripened just yet. Our Italian 258 hasn't really been performing too well, but that's sort of my own fault. So 10% will be late, 30% will be mid-season, and then 60% of them will be early. And what I'm planning to do is have all the late varieties, once again, like we did this year, have them in the greenhouse, but then also have a nice little mix of mid-season varieties and early varieties in the greenhouse, because when you wake them up early and you give them a nice head start in the greenhouse, they just perform exceptionally. They really put out a ton of fruit very early. I'll be getting fruit July 1st, and that has happened 2 years for me. It didn't happen this year because I didn't put any early varieties in the greenhouse. I only let the late varieties hang out there. So that's the plan. And with that, I'm going to have just very early figs, and also we'll have mid-season and early varieties that are not getting a head start underneath the sunroom once again. And those will just ripen right about now. That's kind of really what they do. Early August. I think I can get some of them potentially by July 15th. I think that's the goal for next year on select trees. We'll see how that works out, but I think I can maybe get main crop off of the greenhouse trees June 15th. Might be a stretch, but at least by July 1st. And then I think I can get some off of the potted trees that don't get a head start by July 15th, and definitely by August 1st. Mid-season varieties coming in, sometime around mid-August, and then the late varieties coming in around September 1st. So that's pretty much the plan with the potted trees. And then what we're going to be focusing on is putting a lot more trees in the ground. We already put quite a bit in the ground. It's really becoming more obvious, and we'll get to those points down here at the bottom of the blog post of why it is that I believe this, but it just makes a whole lot more sense to me. They don't really seem to ripen any later. Yeah, they do ripen maybe about 2 weeks later, but even 2 weeks is not really the biggest deal, and most of them, I think I can get them to ripen by August 1st, like the very, very early varieties. I think that's very doable, and with the method that I'm going to be using this winter for protecting them, production is going to be insane. It's going to be much higher, much easier to deal with than these potted trees, so the workload is going to drop significantly. So it's going to be fun. It's going to be interesting. We're going to keep experimenting with different varieties, but that's mostly our plan, is that in the wintertime, we're going to chop them all back to the base. We talked about this, I think, in a prior episode of Fruit Talk. Chop them to about 6 to 12 inches, and then preserve as many canes as possible from the base. And then we're going to cover that, and it'll be insulated. We'll put a layer of tarp down, and then in between the layers of tarp, we're going to have some insulation, whether that's straw or wood chips or some sort of mulch. I also have just insulation that you would use for your house. So hopefully all that will work out well. Okay, so the first thing I've learned this year, the first point I want to make, is that pruning should really be light or very minimal. And if you look at Pons' book here, I actually have my buddy Dom's copy he was able to give me, and I think we talked about this actually in another episode of Fruit Talk, was that light pruning is really what he recommends, or even no pruning at all. Once you get the shape kind of established, the form established, you don't really want to be pruning them, because when you prune these trees too hard, they respond by growing very vigorously, and then your productivity is very low, and you just also have later figs, and you also have less figs. So to me, it just it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and I've mostly been pruning my trees, my potted trees, for cuttings to trade, and that's how my collection grows, or I sell them, and it's a nice way to make an extra few dollars. But this year, I'm really going to limit the number of cuttings I take from my potted trees, and really the main pruning that's going to happen is from the in-ground trees, and that's mostly what we're going to sell. So, that's kind of my approach this year, is that we're not going to be pruning much at all, and if we do, it's going to be very light, which means either you take off the tip and that's it, or you prune about 3 inches. I think another alternative is to prune out an entire branch. If you prune out, I think, portions of the branch, let's say the branch is 6 inches long, you take out 6 inches of the branch, let's say, is 12 inches long, you take out 6 inches of the branch, so we take out half. I think the tree really responds poorly by putting out lots of growth the following year. However, if you take out the entire 12 inches and cut it back to a main branch there, to an older wood, and really thin out the shoots a bit, I think that is a better method of pruning than cutting all the branches back or heading the branches back. So we'll have to put a little bit more thought and research into that. I think there's maybe a little bit of tweaking that I'm going to want to consider, but that's number one. That's the biggest thing I've learned this winter, or this spring and this summer, is that my trees that just got pruned very heavily didn't produce well, and the trees that got pruned, somewhere medium in the middle, somewhere, they produced better. And then the trees that I didn't prune much at all produced extremely well. So, it's just a matter of conditions and techniques that are really determining the differences in these figs. And we've talked about this in the past as well, in that as the grower, you are responsible. It's not, the weather plays an effect, but the weather, and people like to blame, it was just this year was a bad year, or there's a difference in year-to-year conditions and yada, yada, yada. Well, that's only really applicable, in my opinion, if you're doing the same exact thing every single year. But most people are not doing the same exact thing every single year. At least I haven't been. I've been trialing and doing different techniques every single year to see what works and what doesn't. So I can't really blame the weather. Yeah, maybe the weather this year, and it's been a bit rainier this year. There's been less periods in between our rains this year. Excuse me. So our quality of the fruit quality has certainly dropped a bit, but the issues that I've been facing this year are completely my fault. And you need to recognize that as the grower and accept that as the grower, and that's the only way you're going to become a better grower. So one of the things we did this year that was actually really good, was heating up the soil in the spring. And we talked a lot about this. I mean, every video in the spring was kind of about the soil temperatures and getting the soil warmer. And I made one mistake with one of my garden beds. I made one other mistake with one of my fig tree plantings that we have out in the front of the house. And those are more out in the open and more exposed, and they have more rocks that are all around the base of these trees. And because we have so many layers of rocks, they actually were cooling the soil down rather than help heating it up. So really, you only really want like one thin layer of rock, or you want some black plastic down, or you just want bare soil. Any mulch is really going to cool the soil down pretty significantly, and that's what kind of the rock layer does, is that it acts as kind of a form of mulch. But these rocks are absorbing the heat more than, let's say, wood chips as an example. So if you have one little thin layer, it's not going to be the biggest difference there. In fact, I think it's a nice little compromise between function and visual appearance. So I think rocks are a great way to go. And it's nice that I made these mistakes, because if I had done it all one way, I wouldn't have had a control group as an example in the experiment. But because I messed up on one of the garden beds, it was obvious that one garden bed, because we had it mulched with lots of rice holes, because we also had our cool oven crop in there, kind of shading things a bit out, shading out the soil for the most part. Our heat-loving crops that were supposed to come in and eventually take over never did. So that whole bed was kind of a mess, and we now have a late crop of summer crops right now in there. Things like squash and like zucchini. They're actually patty pan squash, and corn and eggplants, and they're finally getting going now. And it's good that I was able to kind of recover that. And the same thing with the trees, the fig trees in the front, how we moved those rocks away. But by the time I moved the rocks away, it was already kind of June, and it was already kind of too late to be doing this. And every little degree of soil temperature matters so much to these trees, and it's such a big difference between the trees I have out back on the south side of the house versus the trees on the north side of the house. The trees on the north side of the house are in their fourth year, while the trees on the south side of the house are almost like seemingly double the size, and they're 2 years younger. It's their second summer versus their fourth summer, and the difference is just astronomical. It's absolutely astronomical. So really warming the ground up is just so important. And same thing in our pots, taking off the mulch in our pots in the beginning of the spring. And I know if you guys live in a drier place, you don't get much rain at all, this is probably a horrible idea. You want to conserve as much moisture as possible at all times. This is really for the people that just get a lot of rain and don't really have to worry about the soil moisture. So again, I just recommend taking off that layer of mulch. And then what you can do, if maybe you get a little bit more, you don't get a whole lot of rain, but you get enough to kind of be on the edge of like desert and temperate climate. Maybe you're in somewhere in between. What I'd recommend is adding the mulch back on right after fruit set. So once the trees set their figs, put the mulch back on. And here's why. This is our third point here. And the third thing I've learned is that consistent soil moisture is very important for quality of our figs. And like I said, mulch is going to cool the soil, but it does aid in better control of soil moisture. That's a fact. It just really does regulate the moisture levels. It really helps keep the right amount of moisture in there at all times. Even if it's pouring, even if it's dry, it really makes things an even level of moisture. And if you don't have that covering on the soil, the top so many inches of the soil are just really not going to perform well. And that's where a lot of our roots are on our fig trees. Our fig trees have roots in realistically the top foot. I think it's, if I read it correctly in Pond's book, if I remember correctly, I think it's the top 18 inches of, 90% of the roots are in the top 18 inches of the soil, I think is exactly what he mentioned in his book. The point is, though, regardless of those numbers, they could be a little bit off there. A lot of the figs have their roots in the top portions of the soil. So if you don't have the right moisture content there, it's going to be a lot harder on that tree, especially if they haven't dived deep down to get that moisture when it's necessary, on our young trees and different things like that, especially a potted tree where whatever's in the container is it. So I'd recommend adding actually the mulch back on, and this is something I wish I had done, because we really struggled this year with the soil moisture. Things were too dry, and I had some figs that fell off and dropped. I had figs that didn't form correctly. I still have figs that are not forming correctly, that are not ripening properly, or half of it's ripening and half of it's dried up. I also have the opposite issue where I tried to rectify this situation and then I overwatered them, and then I had figs that were splitting. So it's really a nasty cycle you can get into, and if you just had the same consistent moisture constantly, you'd be a lot better off. So for the quality, for splitting, for dropping, for just about everything, it's just so important. So add in the mulch back on after you get the fruits setting. What I did this year is I didn't add the mulch back on just yet, as I put a covering over top in the form of the trash bags. So that's a whole other thing. We'll see how well that works out, but it's certainly helping keep the moisture content and the soil more consistent. Any covering will do. So number 5, the 5th thing that we did this year, the number 4 thing we skipped one here. Going back to our point about the in-ground trees and how I'm focusing my attention there, is that the in-ground trees produce just about as early as the potted trees. It really is about a 2-week difference. And in all honesty, there's some varieties that will ripen at the same time as the potted trees. I had some of them this year that ripened just as early as some of my potted trees, maybe because my pruning was a bit too hard this year, but it's just incredible. I think the productivity of these trees, everything about them, the strength of them, the quality of the wood, the quality of the roots, the quality of the figs, it's just a totally different scenario you're dealing with here. So as long as you can get the soil warmed up quicker, and you can get them to wake up around the same time as the potted trees, you're pretty much looking at the same ripening period. And I always thought they were about a month behind, but that's just not true, because of the soil temperatures. Those soil temperatures really make a huge difference in where you plant them in the yard, and thinking about the spring sunlight orientation and how it comes in and how low it is and yada yada yada. It really makes a huge difference. The next big thing that I was really focusing on this year was controlling the sap flow of the trees, controlling the hormones. We talk a lot about pinching and changing up the auxin that way. But sap flow, I think, is one that I haven't really trialed with, and a lot of the people in the fig community haven't trialed with, which is girdling. And we've talked a lot about girdling, and I've since changed my mind from girdling. I don't think that's really the right word, because that's not really what I want to do. I kind of want to just make them bleed a bit. And by making them bleed earlier in the year, it slows down that vigor. It gets rid of that sap flow, which then returns that vigor to a normal level. Once we have a lot of winter kill, we have a lot of pruning that happens. We prune them hard, as an example. They grow and grow and grow, right? So the only thing we can do to combat that, it seems like, is to bleed them and to make them get rid of that sap flow. And I think that works really, really well. We're going to have to see, though, for sure, if it 100% works at the time next year, and how this really has maybe some larger impacts than we might think. If it's a long-term effect thing that it may do, who knows? But the point is, this is something that I'm going to be doing next year, and I think it certainly has worked, because it definitely returns that vigor down to a more normal level, which then allows them to flower. That's really the basics there of growing figs. Number 6, rootstock is really important for specific varieties. Grafting certain varieties, I think, is going to be a necessity. Some varieties that come to my mind are Coledon Blanc. It just seems to be a kind of a weaker tree. Yeah, it puts out some nice growth in the spring, but around, when it gets a bit hot outside, it kind of aborts some of the leaves. It kind of just has a little bit of a shock period, and it doesn't really seem to like life. I don't know. It's something weird about it. I'm not a big fan of how Coledon is on its own roots, and you could say Black Madeira might be the same way, but through adequate feeding, I found that you can kind of get over this for the most part. But even with enough food, it doesn't seem to really make too much of a difference. I think it's just an easier thing to do, and a better way to do it is to come in here and graft these varieties rather than overfeeding them and just really making them super healthy that way. And having this just ridiculous amount of growth on your trees, I think it's more wise and a better approach to come in here and graft them onto a more vigorous rootstock, a healthier rootstock. And I've seen this firsthand with my own tree, my Hated de Argentile. I did it a couple years ago. We just had this idea that grafting, the fig community and I, a couple people on the fig community, I think Steve Rutan was one of them that was kind of encouraging me to do it. I think maybe even Tony was thinking about it or something. But the point is that we had this idea to graft weaker trees that maybe are known to drop, like Pastilliere or Hated de Argentile, or trees that don't really do well, like Ischia Black has been one that's been talked about for a while by Harvey, and of grafting Ischia Black. Trees with really bad fig mosaic virus, graft them onto something really vigorous and healthy, and you'll have yourself a much healthier tree. That was the idea, and certainly I did that with a couple of my trees. I mean, I've grafted so many different varieties at this point, and I've noticed that some rootstocks don't really work out well. The more dwarf rootstocks, the more dwarf trees, the trees that you would think would do better in a container, like Nerucciola de Elba, or maybe some of the Violet de Bordeaux types, or Little Ruby as an example, or Little Miss Figgy. Some of the more slower growing, even Verdino del Nord is another one. I don't think those really make the best rootstock. Even I have a Celeste, even though Celeste is supposed to be very vigorous, I don't think Celeste makes the best rootstock. So I've definitely seen both ends of it, that some make great rootstock and some do not. I think Raspberry Latte makes a great rootstock. obviously brown turkey. I'm going to have to really go through and figure out what I want to air layer so that I can graft onto that next year. I have a big raspberry latte tree that I'm going to put in the ground, and I think that one's going to be just specifically used every year for rootstock rootstock purposes. We're going to graft different varieties onto it to try to get them established on these rootstocks. Things like Ishia Black, Coldenon Blanc. Because my hate of the Argentile, to get back to that point, is that it's a weak tree. It has a weak root system. People have said this for years. It takes a while to get established. It drops at a young age, and I certainly agree with that. And I've noticed it now for 3 years. This is my third summer with it, and last year it didn't do a whole lot, and it was because of scale. And I figured, all right, well, we had scale issue last year. This year should be the year. The third year, it grew well. It looks healthy. It put out a lot of fruit, but it dropped some fruit. And to me, it just looks like a very different tree compared to my other hated de Argentile that is then grafted and also a whole year younger. It looks much more vigorous, much more healthy. The figs even look different. The leaves look better. Everything about it is performing way better. It hasn't dropped a single fig. So for me, I think with certain varieties, I think it's worth it. It's not going to change the dropping issue that some varieties have, because I think that's an unrelated issue. With certain figs, like certain figs can be partially parthenocarpic, meaning that not all of them are common. Some of them may require pollination, or maybe a certain percentage of the fruits require pollination, like Desert King's one where it's a San Pedro, but maybe 10% of the main crop will ripen without pollination. So I think there's other issues with different varieties, but for certain, with hated de Argentile, it's a better idea to graft it. The seventh point here, and the last thing I want to make, is that rejuvenation pruning is something that also Pons has been talking about in his book. Shout out to Dom again. And this is also a method that kind of ASC Pete was recommending on our figs for a long time, and nobody was really listening because it's such a drastic thing to do, where you essentially chop down your entire tree all the way down to the base. If you have a tree that's not really performing well, kind of like my hated de Argentile, it's not doing well, it's not healthy, it doesn't grow well, it doesn't put out a lot of figs, or maybe it drops figs. The idea is to renew the wood, and Pons recommends this for 30-plus-year-old trees. This is when they start needing this kind of practice, and that they start to slow down and they really start to have some issues, and it's just a good idea to renew this every 30 or so years, he recommends. But for some of these, potted trees, they just don't get off to the greatest of starts. So what you can do is you can chop them down all the way to the base, and you see it with our in-ground trees, how they send up new shoots from the base, and those new shoots are extremely healthy. Well, the same thing will happen in a pot, is if you chop it down all the way down to the base, it sends up a new shoot, and that new shoot is very healthy, very vigorous, and it really changes the entire tree from the beginning, from the start. And I think that's just really important. It seems to be working quite apparently to me on one of my trees, Planera. I have a Planera tree that really just hasn't done well since I've had it, and this is now its third summer. It's just been a big disappointment. It barely grows. It barely does anything. So we chopped it down, and it's doing a lot better now. So anyway, guys, that was this little video here, this episode of Fruit Talk. I hope everybody learned something. I hope you guys have been learning something this year. If you have, let me know down in the comments. Comment here down on the blog. I think you can definitely comment on here and subscribe to the newsletter. Like I said, figboss.com. We'll see you all soon. Catch you guys for next week's episode. Take care.